The nurse's face told me before her mouth did. She walked into room 312 of Memorial Health in Savannah at 7:15 in the evening with that specific expression, the look a medical professional wears when carrying a message that falls entirely outside clinical training. Not a health bulletin, but something professionally uncomfortable, personally wrong, and quietly malicious, yet passing it along because the woman in the bed deserved to know. She stood at the foot of my bed, hands folded over her chart, and said, "Mrs. Martha, I need to let you know that a visitor came for you this evening, Reverend Thomas." The silence in the hospital room stretched thin, filled only by the rhythmic pulse of the monitor. He had been turned away right at the nurse's station. "There is a formal note on your electronic file stating that all visitors require explicit approval from your designated next of kin before being admitted to this room. Your daughter-in-law placed that restriction in the system this morning." I looked up at the pale ceiling of room 312. A hospital's ceiling is a very particular kind of canvas, flat, sterile, devoid of personality. It is the surface a person stares at when they need to process betrayal without anything interrupting the hard mathematics of realization. I had been in that bed for 4 days, following a severe spike in blood pressure. For the first 48 hours, my vocal cords had been strained to a breathless whisper, a temporary weakness that Renata had banked on when she manipulated my file behind my back. My voice had returned by midday, but Renata did not know that yet. She had not stepped foot inside room 312 since the second day. I looked directly at the nurse. Her name tag read Pauline. "Pauline," I said, testing my voice the way a winter traveler tests the thickness of ice. "I need my phone." She brought it to me without a single hesitation. "My name is Martha. I'm 68 years old. For 32 years, I taught American literature at Savannah High School. My life was built on structure, on understanding subtext, and on teaching young minds how to read between the lines when polite dialogue masked a calculated motive. For decades, I graded essays where people tried to disguise manipulation as affection. I knew how to spot a false narrative from a mile away. I just never expected to find myself trapped inside one written by my own family. Since my husband, Arthur, passed away 5 years ago, I lived alone in our historic home on Oglethorpe Avenue. My son, David, is 44, an architect who inherited his father's gentle heart. He called me 3 times a week and brought groceries on Sundays. David was never the issue. The issue was Renata. Renata Price, 40 years old, a corporate communications director. Renata possessed that rare, dangerous brand of social engineering where every selfish action was wrapped so tightly in the cellophane of caring that you looked like an ungrateful monster if you tried to unwrap it. When she slowly began inserting herself into my daily routines, it was under the guise of concern. When she rearranged my living room furniture, it was to optimize my safety. Every boundary violation came pre-packaged with a sweet smile. It was the most sophisticated form of control, the kind leaving no solid surface to push back against. For 7 years, I watched that quiet architecture of control assemble itself brick by brick. I stayed silent to protect David's marriage. Until the morning of October 12th. I remember kneeling by my backyard garden, tending to the heritage white roses Arthur had planted. Then came the sharp, sudden dizziness that felt like the sky tilting sideways. Nothing at all until the flashing lights of an ambulance. David arrived at the hospital within the hour, his face showing the raw, unscripted fear of a man punched in the chest by his own mortality. He held my hand. 32 years of teaching had given me an instinctive radar for genuine emotion, and David's fear was real. Renata arrived 2 hours later. I noted the gap. When she walked in, she didn't rush to my bedside to weep. Instead, she stood at the foot of the bed, scanned the medical charts clipped to the rolling stand, and ran her eyes over the monitor readings like an auditor reviewing a corporate quarterly report. "We are going to take good care of you, Martha," she had said, her voice dripping with practiced reassurance. We. That single pronoun had settled like lead in my stomach. By day 2, when my voice was still a whisper and Renata had charmed the administrative desk, she had institutionalized her authority. By day 4, Reverend Thomas, a man who had prayed beside my husband's casket, was turned away at the threshold of my recovery. Renata thought she had checkmated me. She believed the exhaustion had stripped away my authority, leaving me an isolated spectator in my own life. She miscalculated entirely. As Pauline quietly slipped out of room 312, leaving me alone with the hum of the IV pump, I did not cry. Decades of classrooms had taught me that panic is a waste of vital energy. When a narrative turns against you, you don't weep over the plot twist. You pick up the pen and rewrite the chapter. My fingers felt slightly stiff against my smartphone screen, but my mind was as sharp as a blade. I unlocked it, bypassed the notifications, and pulled up my contacts. Renata wanted a locked room. Fine. Let's see how well her administrative walls hold up when the actual owner calls in the Legal Zoning Commission. The hospital room dissolved around me as my mind drifted backward, tracking the slow, methodical siege that had brought me to that bed in the first place. 7 years. That was how long the architecture of control had been quietly building itself around my life, brick by brick, disguised as devotion. Since my husband Arthur passed away from a sudden heart attack, our historic home on Oglethorpe Avenue had stood as a sanctuary of memories. The hardwood floors still echoed with the sound of his footsteps, and the high-ceilinged living room held 30 years of our shared history. But silence is a canvas, and to someone like Renata, an empty canvas is an invitation to paint over it. Renata was 39 then, now 40, a corporate communications director whose father was a prominent local executive. She carried herself with the polished, unyielding confidence of someone accustomed to boardrooms and compliance. She never arrived empty-handed. There were imported cashmere throws, gourmet gift baskets, and designer kitchen gadgets, all presented with a blinding, perfect smile that made you feel small if you didn't beam with gratitude. And then came her favorite weapon, the plural pronoun. "We think it's time to update the kitchen counters, don't we, David?" she would say, smiling at her husband while treating me like a spectator in my own home. "We decided that Monday is the best day for your grocery delivery," she announced one afternoon, casually erasing my independence one scheduled appointment at a time. Every intrusion was wrapped so tightly in the cellophane of caring that to protest would make you look like a monster. The physical dismantling of my home began 6 months after Arthur passed. Renata walked into my living room holding a clipboard, looked at the framed oil painting of our 1978 anniversary, and sighed with theatrical pity. "Mama, this dark wood frame just suffocates the room," she said, her voice dripping with condescending sweetness. "We're going to help you brighten things up. It's for your own peace of mind." Before I could object, professional movers she had hired were taking it down, replacing it with a cold, minimalist abstract canvas that looked like a spilled plate of ink. When I tried to speak up, she smiled right through me. "Trust me, Mama, modern energy clears the mind. You'll thank me later." That was only the structural phase. The financial encroachment followed shortly after. Under the terrifying banner of protecting me from modern cyber scams, Renata insisted on auditing my retirement savings account. She sat at my antique mahogany desk with an Excel spreadsheet glowing on her tablet, scrolling through decades of my careful bookkeeping with a look of mild corporate disdain. "Your accounts are so fragmented, Mama," she noted, tapping the screen with a manicured finger. "It's a security risk. David is too busy with architectural blueprints to oversee this, so I've taken the liberty of linking your primary pension fund to our household portfolio management portal. It's just safer for everyone." When I pulled my hand back and said, "Renata, I have managed my own finances since before you were born," she didn't blink. She just tilted her head, let out a soft, pitying sigh, and dropped a line that still rings in my ears. "Mama, please don't make things harder on yourself when we are only trying to keep you safe from your own blind spots." She made me feel like an aging tenant in a building she already owned. The final frontier of her isolation campaign was my social circle. For decades, the Wednesday afternoon literature and tea circle with my retired colleagues had been my anchor. When my longtime friend Clara called to check why I missed 2 meetings, I went to return her call, only to find my landline call log wiped and my cell phone settings altered. Renata had intercepted Clara's call. When confronted, she patted my hand with sickening condescension. "Clara is lovely, Mama, but she talks too much about old age and illnesses. It triggers your anxiety. We filtered those calls so you can rest in peace." Why didn't I scream? Why did I swallow the bitter pill day after day, year after year? Because of David. My son was 45, an architect whose creative genius was matched only by his profound emotional blindness. David inherited his father's gentle, conflict-avoidant heart. When Renata rearranged my life, David saw nothing but a devoted wife trying to help a grieving mother. Whenever I tried to hint at the suffocation I felt, David would look at me with tired, earnest eyes and say, "Mama, Renata just wants us to be safe. She loves you in her own way. Please don't create friction. You know how stressed my work makes me." So I chose silence. I swallowed my pride, bit my tongue, and let the walls close in, believing that my endurance was the price of keeping my son's family intact. I thought my patience was a virtue. I did not realize that silence is not a shield against a predator. It is simply an open invitation to conquer the rest of the territory. The collapse didn't happen with cinematic grandeur or theatrical cries. It happened quietly on the crisp morning of October 12th, right beside the heritage white roses Arthur had planted the year we retired. I had been kneeling by the damp soil, tending to the roots, when the sky suddenly tilted sideways. A sharp, white-hot pressure slammed against the back of my skull, and the world dissolved into a sickening blur of green and gray before everything went completely black. When consciousness finally drifted back, I was lying in a hospital bed at Memorial Health, my body feeling as though it had been weighted down with lead. The air smelled of sterile antiseptic and machine oil, the steady pulse of the heart monitor marking the slow passage of time in that sterile room. David arrived within the hour. When he pushed open the door to my cubicle, his face carried the raw, unscripted terror of a man who had just been punched in the chest by his own mortality. He didn't rush to make a speech or compose himself. He simply dropped into the chair beside my bed, gripped my hand with fingers that were visibly shaking, and pressed his forehead against my knuckles. His breathing was ragged, and his eyes were red-rimmed and damp. In that quiet, terrifying moment, all the subtle distance that Renata had tried to wedge between us vanished. David's fear was completely, undeniably real. He was a son terrified of losing the last anchor of his family. 2 hours later, the heavy door swung open again. Renata walked in. I noted the exact gap on the digital clock mounted on the hospital wall. 2 hours. She had not rushed to the emergency room upon hearing the news. She had taken her time, ensuring her entrance would be calculated, deliberate, and staged for maximum social impact. Instead of rushing to my bedside to squeeze my hand or shed a comforting tear, she bypassed me entirely, walking straight to the rolling chart stand at the foot of the bed. She flipped open the medical file with the sharp, rhythmic snap of a corporate auditor reviewing a quarterly deficit, her eyes scanning the monitor readings and doctor's notes with cold, clinical detachment. "We are going to take good care of you, Martha," she said, her voice dropping into that smooth, polished register she reserved for managing optics. That plural pronoun again, we. Before I could muster the strength to push past the heavy fog in my head, Renata had already turned her attention to the hallway, catching a passing administrator. She began speaking in low, clipped tones, expertly navigating hospital protocols under the guise of an exhausted, devoted family member, alleviating my burden. The true trap was sprung later that afternoon, while David was temporarily out of the room fetching a cup of coffee from the lobby downstairs. Renata sat down in the chair David had just vacated, smoothing down the front of her tailored wool blazer with unhurried precision. She looked at me with a soft, patronizing smile that didn't reach her eyes. "David is completely falling apart out there, Mama," she said, her voice dropping to a sympathetic hum. "He's in no emotional state to handle the mountain of medical administration this hospital requires." She pulled a crisp, folded document from her designer leather portfolio and slid it across the overbed table alongside a sleek silver pen. Just then, the door clicked open and David stepped back inside, holding a small paper cup of water. He looked exhausted, his shoulders slumped under the crushing weight of panic and fatigue. Renata turned her attention instantly to her husband, her voice softening into an expert blend of comfort and gentle directive. "David, darling," she looked up at him with wide, earnest eyes. "To save you from running back and forth between the administrative desk and ICU clearance, I've prepared a temporary medical care proxy. That way, I can handle all the paperwork and facility approvals." She turned the page slightly, pointing a manicured nail toward the signature line. "Just sign here, honey. Let me take the heavy burden off your shoulders so you can focus entirely on staying by your mother's side." David didn't hesitate for a single second, driven by raw panic, a desperate desire to protect me, and complete trust in the woman sharing his life. He took the pen from her fingers. He didn't read the dense legal fine print crowded at the bottom of the page, the clauses Renata had carefully embedded into the margins, granting her blanket administrative control over my electronic medical files, visitor access, and discharge routing. He just leaned down, signed his name, and handed the document back to his wife. I lay against the scratchy hospital pillows, my voice trapped in a breathless whisper by the remnants of my blood pressure spike. I watched Renata take the signed paper back, her fingers closing over it with the quiet satisfaction of a strategist securing a vital territorial gain. She used my son's love as a weapon against me. She had laundered her own desire for total control through a grieving son's panic, turning a loving child into an unwitting accomplice in my imprisonment. She had legalized her blockade before I even woke up, sealing my fate under the guise of bureaucratic necessity. The digital clock on the sterile hospital wall clicked over to Wednesday morning, marking 48 hours since David had signed that fatal document under intense duress. My body still felt sluggish, drained by the lingering effects of the severe blood pressure spike and the heavy medications pumping through my veins. But my mind had snapped into a razor-sharp focus. Under the relaxed rules of morning visiting hours, the ward nurse stepped out for a brief moment to refill supply carts down the corridor, leaving the tray table entirely unattended. My cell phone lay right there, tucked underneath a stack of hospital information pamphlets where Renata had carelessly tossed it after silencing the ringer 2 days ago. My fingers, stiff and trembling, reached across the plastic surface. I slipped the phone under the edge of my blanket, clutching it against my chest like a fragile lifeline in a stormy sea. I didn't waste a single second. As soon as the room was completely clear of staff, I unlocked the screen, bypassed the blocked call logs, and dialed the first number that had been etched into my memory for over 22 years. Evelyn Vance answered on the third ring. Evelyn was a formidable woman, a family estate attorney with 25 years of experience navigating the ruthless, cutthroat legal corridors of Savannah. Her voice, usually steady, measured, and unshakable, caught a sharp note of genuine surprise when she heard my weak whisper crackle through the speaker. "Martha? Where are you? David told me you were taking a quiet week of rest at home, completely unreachable to clients and friends." "I am in Memorial Health, Evelyn," I whispered back, my voice tight with a fierce, quiet urgency. "I need you to pull my comprehensive estate file right now, specifically the original Advance Healthcare Directive and my final will." There was a brief, tense pause on the line, broken only by the faint rustle of heavy parchment and digital files clicking open on her office computer, followed immediately by a sharp intake of breath that told me everything I needed to know. "Martha, this document explicitly names David as your sole and exclusive proxy, with an ironclad non-transferability clause written directly into the statutory text. There is no legal mechanism on earth that permits him to assign, share, or subcontract these decision-making rights to Renata. Whatever document your daughter-in-law had him sign at that bedside is legally void, a fraudulent misrepresentation of statutory authority. I am closing my laptop this exact second. Hang tight, Martha. I'll be through those hospital doors in 30 minutes with a certified copy of your original directives and a court-ready injunction if anyone tries to stand in my way." The line clicked dead. One line of defense secured. But I needed a second anchor, someone who could pierce through the administrative fortress Renata was building around my room. My fingers flew across the keypad once more, dialing a number I had prayed I wouldn't have to use under such bleak, isolating circumstances. Pastor Thomas answered on the first ring, his voice heavy with a quiet, persistent sorrow that spoke volumes. He had known our family for 20 years, officiating Arthur's funeral and baptizing David when he was just a boy with bright, untroubled eyes. "Martha, my dear, I have tried calling your cell phone 3 times since yesterday afternoon," the pastor said softly, his words laden with deep concern. "The nurse at the front desk told me visitors were strictly restricted by family decree. They turned me away at the lobby doors." "Where are you right now, Thomas?" I asked, leaning forward against the scratchy hospital pillows, ignoring the dull ache throbbing in my skull. "I am sitting right out in the parking lot in my sedan, parked under the old oak tree facing the east wing," he replied, his voice steady, faithful, and entirely unyielding. "I couldn't bring myself to drive away, Martha. Something felt profoundly wrong in my spirit, and I refused to leave you isolated in that sterile place." A wave of profound relief washed over me, hot and stinging behind my tired eyelids. "Don't leave," I whispered fiercely into the receiver. "Come up to room 312 right now. Bring your caller, Thomas. We're going to need a witness with true moral authority when the wolves try to close in." Less than 40 minutes later, the heavy wooden door of room 312 creaked open. It was a cinematic convergence that no corporate strategist like Renata could ever anticipate or calculate on a spreadsheet. Pastor Thomas slipped quietly through the door first, his steady, comforting presence filling the sterile space with a quiet dignity that instantly pushed back the oppressive, clinical atmosphere of the ward. He took a seat in the armchair by the window, offering me a warm, reassuring nod of absolute solidarity. Scarcely 10 minutes after that, the door swung open with a sharp, authoritative push. Evelyn Vance strode into the room, her tailored charcoal blazer crisp, her leather briefcase gripped firmly in her hand like a shield. She didn't waste time with polite prelatures or small talk. She walked straight to my bedside, placed a certified embossed legal portfolio squarely on top of the rolling medical tray, and looked down at me with an expression of unyielding resolve. "The files are here, Martha, and the legal boundaries have been drawn. Let them try to shut us out now." Inside that hospital room, the balance of power shifted in a matter of minutes. Renata had spent years building a cage of isolation, locking the doors and throwing away the key under the guise of loving care. But she had made one fatal miscalculation. She assumed the people who truly loved me would simply fade into the background without a fight. They were here now, and the reckoning had officially begun. The sterile lights of room 312 hummed softly in the evening quiet as the digital wall clock clicked precisely to 8 o'clock. The heavy wooden door swung open with a smooth, oiled glide, and Renata stepped across the threshold. She moved with the effortless, unshakable confidence of a woman accustomed to total victory, carrying a designer basket of imported autumn fruits, entirely convinced that she was walking into a room of quiet surrender, where her authority was absolute and unchallenged. She froze dead in her tracks, her polished footsteps cutting off mid-stride as her eyes adjusted to the interior. The picture greeting her eyes was not the pathetic, depressing scene of a frail, bedridden invalid waiting submissively for instructions or medical orders. It was an unyielding wall of defense, a miniature tribunal assembled right in the heart of the hospital ward to pass final judgment on her years of quiet tyranny. On the left side of the bed, sitting quietly in the armchair with his hands folded over a worn leather Bible, sat Pastor Thomas, his presence radiating an unshakable, grounding peace that completely neutralized the clinical tension of the room. On the right side, standing upright with crisp professional authority, stood Evelyn Vance, her leather briefcase unlatched and resting firmly on the tray table, pages of stamped legal documentation catching the harsh fluorescent light. And right in the center, supported by the pillows I had stubbornly dragged upright, sat me. My spine was straight, my hands steady against the blanket, and my eyes locked onto my daughter-in-law with a cold, piercing clarity that needed no translation. Renata's immaculate smile faltered, twitching for a fraction of a second before her corporate mask scrambled frantically to regain control of her optics. Before she could form a single syllable of her practiced, manipulative script, Evelyn stepped forward, placing a formal, heavily embossed legal notice directly on top of the fruit basket. "Good evening, Renata," Evelyn said, her voice cutting through the clinical silence like a razor-sharp scalpel. "I am Evelyn Vance, legal counsel for Martha. You are looking at a formal notice of revocation and statutory nullification regarding the bedside document you had David sign 48 hours ago under duress. A duplicate copy has already been transmitted to the Hospital Security Administration and your residential address via electronic filing. Any further attempt on your part to restrict visitor access, control medical disclosures, or interfere with my client's personal autonomy will result in an immediate criminal filing for fraud and elder coercion." The color drained from Renata's face so fast it looked as though someone had pulled a dark shade behind her skin. The basket of fruit slipped slightly in her grip, the cellophane crackling sharply in the dead silence of the ward. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to scream or curse or let decades of pent-up rage spill over in a messy, undignified fit. I simply looked at her the way I used to look at unruly students who thought they could outsmart the classroom, calmly, objectively, seeing right through every single layer of their clever deceptions. 7 years, Renata, I said, my voice carrying the steady, measured cadence of an old teacher laying out an inescapable truth on a blackboard. 7 years of painting over my memories, rewriting my checkbooks, intercepting my friends, and hiding behind my son's gentle heart to build your little cage. You thought you could launder your hunger for control through a grieving son's panic. You thought silence meant weakness. Renata's mouth opened, her survival instincts immediately driving her toward the familiar, pathetic performance of wounded innocence. "Mama, you are completely disoriented by the heavy medication," she started, her voice pitching upward into that practiced, theatrical whine designed to cast doubt on her victim. "Don't you dare," I cut her off, the single sharp sentence dropping like an iron gate between us. "The performance is over, Renata. The hospital security log shows every restricted call, the estate files show every unauthorized transfer, and David is currently sitting downstairs in the cafeteria reading the original directives your husband was tricked into bypassing. You are entirely alone in this room." She tried to hold her ground, her eyes darting frantically between the attorney, the pastor, and myself, searching for a single crack in our armor, a single legal loop she could twist to her advantage. But there was nothing left to exploit. The walls she had spent 7 years constructing around my life had caved in, and she was standing right in the absolute rubble of her own design. For the first time since I had known her, Renata had absolutely nothing to say. Her lips pressed into a thin white line of pure, unadulterated venom. She didn't drop the fruit basket. She simply let it go thudding heavily onto the linoleum floor before turning abruptly on her heel. She walked out of room 312 without looking back, the heavy door clicking shut behind her like the finality of a courtroom gavel coming down on a closed case. The air in the room changed instantly, lifting a suffocating weight I hadn't realized I had been carrying for nearly a decade. The cage was broken. The predator had been defeated, not by brute force or angry shouting, but by the quiet, immovable weight of the truth and the unyielding shield of the law. For years, every sunset had brought a quiet dread, a heavy sense of enclosure as the doors of my own home were locked against the world by a daughter-in-law who wore a benevolent smile while tightening the screws of isolation. I had spent countless nights staring at the ceiling, wondering if anyone would ever pierce through the polished armor of respectability she had constructed around our family name. But sitting here tonight, surrounded by the unbending loyalty of old friends who saw past the corporate facade, I understood the profound power of truth when it is finally given a voice. The silence that followed Renata's exit wasn't empty. It was filled with the resonant echoes of accountability, marking the permanent end of an era where manipulation reigned unchecked. Every ticking second on that wall clock felt like a small victory, washing away the bitter taste of helplessness that had lingered on my tongue since the day Arthur passed away. I looked over at Evelyn and Pastor Thomas, and in their steady eyes, I saw the reflection of a life reclaimed from the shadows. The battle was far from over, but the darkest chapter had officially closed. The pale morning light of Thursday crept slowly through the window blinds of room 312, casting long, quiet shadows across the sterile linoleum floor. I was already awake, sitting propped up against the pillows, waiting in the stillness when the heavy wooden door creaked open with a soft sigh. It wasn't Evelyn with her legal briefs, and it wasn't Pastor Thomas with his comforting hymns. It was David. He stood in the doorway for a long, agonizing moment, looking small, broken, and utterly exhausted. The harsh, bruised circles carved deep beneath his eyes told the complete story of a brutal, sleepless night spent in the wake of an earthquake. After Renata had stormed out of this very hospital room 2 nights ago, she had returned home to a catastrophic reckoning she could neither manipulate nor talk her way out of. David had finally seen the full, ugly blueprint of her 7-year campaign of isolation, financial control, and quiet deceit. The confrontation at home had torn their household apart, stripping away every last illusion of domestic perfection he had clung to for the sake of his marriage. He didn't say a single word as he walked slowly, heavily toward the bed, his feet dragging as if carrying lead weights, feeling the absolute weight of his failure pressing down on his chest. Before I could even gather my thoughts, David dropped hard to his knees right beside the edge of the mattress. He buried his face deep in the cotton blankets, clutching my frail, tired hands tightly against his chest, and began to sob. It wasn't the quiet, controlled grief he had shown at his father's funeral. It was the raw, shattering breakdown of a grown man whose own blind, innocent trust had been weaponized like a dagger to stab his own mother in the back. "Mama, oh God, Mama, I am so sorry," he choked out, his voice cracking violently between ragged sobs that shook his entire frame. "I let her do this right under my nose. I handed them the keys to your life. I thought I was keeping the peace, but I was just handing her the knife to cut you down piece by piece." I didn't pull my hands away from his grip. I didn't scold him or lecture him or pour bitter salt into a wound that was already bleeding out. I simply reached down, my trembling fingers gently brushing through his thinning hair the exact same way I used to do when he was a frightened little boy, waking up from a childhood nightmare. "Look at me, David," I said, softly, my voice carrying the steady, grounding warmth of a mother who had weathered every storm by his side. "You loved your wife, and you trusted her because you believed marriage meant sharing an unreserved life. There is no shame in having a good heart, David. But loving someone fiercely does not mean turning a blind eye to cruelty. It does not mean letting toxic control masquerade as care. You have to learn how to protect the sanctuary of your own home before you let the shadow of manipulation swallow the life you two share." David stared at me, the words sinking deep into the raw, aching fabric of his conscience. For months, he had been trapped between loyalty to a mother he loved and devotion to a wife who consumed him. Now, looking into my eyes, the heavy fog of confusion finally lifted, replaced with a painful, sobering clarity. He nodded slowly, his grip on my hand tightening with a quiet, solemn resolve. In that heavy hospital room, amidst the lingering scent of antiseptic and fading fear, the invisible chains that had bound our family for years finally snapped. He wiped the tears from his cheeks, standing up with a posture that felt lighter, as if a mountain had been lifted off his shoulders. The road ahead of him would be long and fraught with legal and emotional battles against a woman who would not surrender easily. But for the first time in years, my son was truly standing on his own 2 feet, ready to face the truth with open eyes and a clear soul. For so long, I had worried that my silence would be our family's undoing, that letting things slide for the sake of peace would destroy us from within. But looking at David now, I realized that true peace only comes after the storm has cleared away the debris. The air in the room felt lighter, carrying the quiet promise of a brand new dawn. Every second of pain we had endured over the past week had served a purpose, stripping away the lies and leaving behind the unvarnished truth. We had finally stepped out of the shadow together, ready for whatever came next in this life. 2 weeks after that heavy, transformative morning in room 312, I was finally discharged from the hospital and brought back home to the familiar rooms on Oglethorpe Avenue. The autumn air outside was crisp and clear, smelling faintly of dry maple leaves and damp earth, but inside, the atmosphere felt remarkably still, as if the very walls were exhaling a long-held sigh of relief after years of quiet suffocation. It wasn't a casual family visit or a routine Sunday dinner. It was a carefully orchestrated reckoning arranged by David, who stood quietly near the grandfather clock in the old living room, his posture upright and resolute. Across from us sat Renata. The sharp, untouchable armor of superiority she had worn for years was completely gone. She looked smaller, her shoulders hunched under an invisible weight, her gaze locked nervously on the Persian rug beneath her feet, as if she were waiting for the floor to drop out from under her entirely. For a long time, nobody spoke. The silence stretched thin, heavy with the weight of every unspoken truth that had finally caught up to our family. Then, in a voice stripped of all its usual bite and calculated arrogance, Renata finally broke the quiet. "I didn't mean for it to become a war," she murmured, her hands trembling as she clutched a paper cup. "My father, he ruled our house with an iron fist. Every decision, every penny, every single breath I took was monitored. I spent my whole childhood terrified of losing control. When I came into this family, I saw your independence, Martha, and it terrified me. I thought if I didn't control everything around me, my whole world would collapse, just like it did when I was a child." She stopped, looking up with eyes that carried a dull, hollow ache. I looked back at her, feeling no bitter triumph, only a quiet, heavy sorrow for the generational cycles of poison that people carry inside them like an untreated disease. Understanding where your demons come from is not the same as asking me to excuse what you did, Renata, I told her, keeping my voice steady, calm, and entirely unyielding. A wounded past explains why you strike out, but it does not give you the right to turn my home into your prison. We are not here to heal your childhood. If you want to step foot in this house again, it will happen on one absolute, non-negotiable condition. You come out of genuine respect, not out of a need to manage or manipulate our lives. If you cannot accept that boundary, then distance is the only protection we have left. Renata flinched, swallowing hard, but she didn't argue back. She simply nodded once, a sharp, defeated motion that signaled the definitive end of an era. Now, looking back on it all, that afternoon marked the true turning point of my final chapter. Today, the afternoon sun is dipping low behind the maples, painting the autumn sky in rich shades of bruised gold and amber. I am sitting right here on my old wooden rocking chair on the front porch of Oglethorpe Avenue, a warm mug of chamomile tea resting safely between my palms. Down in the garden, the autumn chrysanthemums are finally blooming in brilliant bursts of yellow and white, untouched, vibrant, and entirely free. I take a slow sip of the tea, listening to the gentle creak of the wood beneath me. A quiet, profound sense of relief washes over me, warm and deep. After all these years spent measuring out the turbulence of other people's demands, navigating storms I never asked for, and guarding my peace inch by inch, I finally understand the ultimate truth of aging and grace. True freedom isn't about winning every argument or holding on to bitterness. It is about drawing a clean, uncrossable line around your own soul and refusing to let anyone ever take it away from you.
Before we say goodbye, I want to talk to you for just a moment. Wherever you are right now, what city are you sitting in, and what time is it on your clock as you watch this? Let me know in the comments below so I can see just how far the story traveled to reach you. More importantly, looking at this story, what is the biggest lesson you are taking away today? Is it about the strength to stand back up when everything is stripped away, the courage to walk away from toxic bonds, or the realization that human dignity and self-respect can never be bought with a price tag? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and I would love to know how this resonated with you. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next story. Thank you so much for watching. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.